I was adopted by an American couple, but I was born in Mexico. I never really felt a connection to either side though. We never celebrated nor participated in any of my Mexican heritage, nor did I feel welcomed into the American ideals. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky and was basically an outcast because I was essentially a stranger to them. I was kind of a loner. No friends. A cordial relationship with my parents. But I was content. I had a home, food, and comforts here and there. Yet I had so many questions about my family history that I knew couldn't be answered, as my parents didn't really have much information to offer. I was found abandoned on the footsteps of some church in Jalisco. But there was that yearning to find my biological family, or at least some semblance of my family history. So, for my birthday, I asked for one of those kids. I can still remember our conversation. "Sweetie, are you sure about this?" my mother asked. "Yeah, we just don't want you coming in with unrealistic expectations," my father interjected. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure," I remember replying. "No matter what though, you guys are my parents and my actual family. I don't have any expectations, honestly. If I think my biological family is not what I was looking for, I'll just move on. I need this, please," I pleaded. God, I was so dumb. Eventually, my little spiel got into their heads and further encouragement from my therapist solidified my parents' agreement. I got the kit itself sometime during February. It was nothing special. The instructions just said to spit into the vial and ship it out, and I would get my results in a couple of weeks. I remember the wait for my results. I tried to hide my excitement, but every night I would imagine this scenario, where I would end up related to someone really cool and famous or whatever. Every night I would check my email in hopes that it would come in early. And then one morning I awoke to see the message. "Congratulations, your reports are ready for viewing. If you have any questions, please call the number below." I quickly logged onto the website to see my profile. There was a global map with the highlighted countries where you had possible ancestry. In my case, every country was highlighted. I had such a small ancestry from every possible location on the map, but there was a chunk with 20% that was left untraced. As interesting as that part was, I was more interested in the relatives section. I've heard of people finding up to hundreds of different relatives, even if they were far removed. But upon clicking the relatives section, all I got was the message, "No relatives available." You can imagine my disappointment. I spent the entire day pretty disheartened, and my parents tried to cheer me up that day, but it felt like there was a piece in me that questioned if I was going to be truly alone in this world. I'm not disparaging my parents or anything, but at the time, I believed that blood meant something. That Saturday, I finally decided to put all that aside and go out to dinner with my parents. We went to a cute little diner and just sat there talking about the next steps. "Sweetie, I got into contact with a private investigator. His name is Jason, and I forgot his last name, but it was something Russian," my mother insisted. "How did you forget his last name already?" my father interjected. "Is that the point, Richard?" my mother replied. "Wait, you guys would really do that? Isn't that kind of expensive?" I asked. "Nick, sweetie, don't worry about the cost. I just want you to stay focused on your grades and we'll make sure to find your parents or any relatives. I already gave all the information to the PI, and he said that he would get into contact with us soon." "Wait a minute, how do we know he didn't just take the money and run?" my father questioned. "Because he didn't charge us just yet. And besides, I looked through his reviews and asked around and he got glowing recommendations. I felt like a total spy meeting up with him." My mother giggled as she held up a glass of wine and sipped it. The rest of the night went by smoothly, and we called it a night once my mother was a little tipsy. As we passed red light after red light, I couldn't help but notice this black SUV trail us on the way back. Ordinarily, it wouldn't have caught my eye, but once we had made our fifth turn, it did raise my eyebrow. But right as we pulled into our driveway, it drove past our house. We lived on the outskirts of the town and our road was another way in and out of the town, so I chalked it up to a mere coincidence. Although our part of town was more secluded, it wasn't all that uncommon for cars to pass by. The morning after, we went about our usual Sunday and went to Mass. As usual, the priest ranted about another problem plaguing our world, and it would have been another usual Mass service. But I noticed that we had received new people in our congregation. A very old, shriveled-up man in an elegant tan suit sat right next to a pretty blonde in a gorgeous sundress at the very last pew. That made the rest of us seem like we were beggars dressed in rags. The man had a strange tattoo on his neck, which wouldn't have been visible, but the collar of his shirt was slightly open, exposing it even more. At the end of the Mass, my parents wanted to go up and introduce ourselves, but when we turned around, they were gone. That's kind of weird, my dad pointed out. Oh, maybe they're just shy. If we see them next week, we'll invite them over for dinner or something. My mother insisted before going off to speak to the other members of the congregation. We were there for a while and eventually I got bored, so I went to go wait in the car. As I sat in my dad's car, I couldn't help but notice the same couple sitting in the same black SUV that trailed us the night before. Or at least I thought it was the same car. Right as I was about to take a closer look, my car door swung open. Sweetie, could you hold this bag? I went to the shop across the street and got a bag of bagels and they're quite warm, my mother said hastily while giving me the brown paper bag. I turned around to take another look, but they were already pulling out and going down the street. That night, I stayed up pretty late doing some last-minute project when I remembered that I was supposed to take the trash out to the curb. The garbage truck was going to pass by in the morning, and so I put my shoes on and quickly went outside to pull it out. Our house was surrounded by trees with a single road coming up to our driveway. As obstructive as the trees were, I could still get a glimpse of the main road and the faint outline of that same black SUV. It was just parked facing our way. As I began to get closer, its headlights turned on and they drove away. I wanted to tell my parents, but it was 3 in the morning, and I didn't feel like waking them for something that I had no evidence of. Besides, I didn't think they would have been able to do anything. God, I wish I had. The next day, I went to school and went about my day. By third period, I was in the middle of a test when there was a knock on the classroom door. The principal stood there with a dean talking on his walkie-talkie. He motioned for the teacher to step outside with him, and the dean came in, hushing us to be silent. Focus on your exams, he said quietly while looking down at his shoes while avoiding eye contact with anyone. Nicholas Johnson, the teacher asked loudly. I could feel every eye on me as I looked over at both of them. Could you come out here for a second? She asked in a weird tone. I started to get up, feeling awkward that everyone had suddenly remembered my existence. Oh, and bring your stuff with you, baby, she quickly added. I stepped outside with my things and started to follow the principal and the teacher herself, our footsteps echoing through the quietness of the hallway. We stepped inside of the cold office where a brunette woman in a black blazer was sitting. They motioned for me to take a seat while they all sat down. There's no easy way for us to say this, but there was a fire at your home this morning, the woman spoke. Unfortunately, there were no survivors. Both your parents have passed away. I'm sorry. And with that sentence, I felt the world stop. It was as if everything had gone silent before coming down and crushing me. I am truly sorry, the woman said while everyone else in the room stood quiet. Is there anyone we could call? I shook my head. My Uncle Bernard is the only one, but we haven't seen him in years and I don't know his number. I didn't add that I also didn't really want to see him. Considering the last time we saw him, he was off on a drug binge. He was a former veteran that resorted to unsavory medications. The woman nodded before handing me a tissue. Here, wipe your tears away and we'll figure this out, okay? I just nodded and took the tissue. I didn't even realize that my eyes were teary. So what do I do now? Where am I going to stay? I asked. Well, because you still haven't turned 18, you'll be placed in a group home temporarily. That's actually where I will be taking you as of today. Once we get there, we will discuss all the details and get into contact with your parents' attorney. Is that okay? No, it wasn't okay that my parents were dead and now my house was burned down, but I merely nodded. She discussed a few more details and the teacher along with the principal, escorting me out into her Prius. After a couple of hours, we ended up in an ugly, gray facility. It seemed more like a prison, to be honest. There were big steel gates blocking the front road. This seems a little extra for a group home, I said, looking around to see if there was anything around. It looked like it was even more secluded than our town. Come to think of it, our town was small, but it wasn't that small where we had to drive hours away for a group home. Don't worry, it's perfectly safe and your parents' attorney will probably be inside, she reassured me. Wait, did my parents even have an attorney? I asked. A court-appointed social worker will be arriving soon, she said, pulling up to the gate which automatically opened. It was as if they were already waiting for us. Once we stepped inside, I realized the place looked strange. It actually did look like a prison. There was a front desk and several men in security uniforms walking around. The woman emerged from a nearby door holding some kind of hospital gown out for me to take. Here, you will change into these in that room over there. There will be a basket where you can put your personal possessions into and come out when you're ready, she stated in a hurry. I went into the room to change. It was rather small, no bigger than one of these store dressing rooms, and there was a small metal bin where I put my clothes and my bag. I put my phone into the side of my boxer briefs though. There was no way I was going to put that into the bin. The gown was baggy enough to hide it. No social worker, but there was something too strange about all this. I stepped out of the dressing room and before I knew it, guards came out of the sides, grabbing onto my arms. I tried to fight them, but the woman pulled a syringe and stuck it in my neck. After that, I blacked out. I woke up in a tiny empty room, like a psych ward. I was in a straitjacket and the room was all padded up. Where was I, and what was going on? I tried to wiggle and feel my phone, but I realized that it must have been taken by them. Dang it. Hey, let me go. I don't know who you are, but I have rights. Let me out of here. I yelled out, trying to bang on the door. Hey, can you shut up? A muffled voice yelled out. Who's there? I responded. I'm next door, so you can't see me, but there's a vent in the ceiling that carries your voice. They spoke. It sounded like a male, but I wasn't too sure. Why are we in here? Oh, I asked. Are you new? He asked. New to what? What's your name? He asked. Nicholas Johnson. Oh, that's a new name. I haven't heard of a Nick. What kind of person has never heard of a Nick? That's the most basic name there is. My name, well, official name is Test Subject 1830, but you can call me Jack. Test Subject? What do you mean, Test Subject? What is this? Oh, this is a collective facility. I'm not too sure about all the details, but they track and gather anyone with special DNA. Special? Yeah. So you know how there were different types of human species like Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and that last one which I never learned the name of. Something like Denizen. Small humans. Barely. Didn't they go extinct like thousands of years ago? Well, sort of. They disappeared, but there are still traces of them in our DNA. Well, that depends on the population. Anyway, there was another species of humans known as the Anunnaki. They weren't anything special and they went extinct as well. Okay, so what does that have to do with me? Well, so the standard DNA is made up of 4 sugars: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. These combinations make up our genes. But the Anunnaki had another sugar molecule or something like that called ambromin. Ambromin? Yeah, it's undetectable unless you know what you're looking for. The general public doesn't even know about it. Only the collective has information about it, and they keep it very tight-lipped. So how do you know about it? I've lived here all my life, well, most of it. I think I was born somewhere in the Philippines. I barely have any memories of that place though. Every time they harvest for me, I forget more and more. What do you mean harvest? Harvest. They need to extract some of our bone marrow and utilize these cells or something like that. I'm not sure. Harold always gets fuzzy with the explanations. Sometimes I feel like he tries to confuse me. Or maybe he's confused himself. Harold? Yeah, Dr. Rigo. He's the guy in charge of the extractions. I've known him since I was little. How old are you? I'm not sure. I asked Harold once and he said somewhere between the age of 18 to 20. So when do we get out, or when does this end? It doesn't. What do you mean? But before he could finish his sentence, my door swung open, and a couple of security guards burst in. Once again, I tried to fight back, but they stuck me with whatever it was that was knocking me out. When I woke up this time, I was lying in a hospital bed with several restraints. Whatever it was they were giving me was making me weaker and weaker. I looked around and saw that I wasn't alone. There was a giant light on top of me, like those of a dentist office. The room was dark, but I could make out a large glass mirror with several people standing behind it. One of them was that same pretty blonde woman who I saw at the mass service, and there were several others standing around with her, including the man who came to the service with her, only he was now several years younger. At first, I thought he was related, but when I squinted my eyes, I saw that he had the same tattoo. I'm still not sure how that was possible. They all seemed flawless, like they carried this ethereal glow to them. A pretty weird thought, but even though I was tied down, I still had eyes. It wasn't like a nice type of attractive though, but rather artificial, like that of a porcelain doll. Every feature was completely smooth, and they had a neutral yet sinister expression. Their face looked wrong somehow. It was as if something had combined the words "most beautiful people" and pasted them onto a mannequin. I felt the bed tilt forward to the point where I was straight up facing the glass window. I heard footsteps coming near me and I heard the movement of surgical tools. Don't panic, it'll only be a second. You're just going to feel a tiny pinch, whispered a husky voice. Please, don't, I begged. I tried to push against the restraints but couldn't even move a finger. I'm assuming you're probably trying to move. I can see it on the heart monitor. But don't worry, the nerve blocker will prevent you from hurting yourself. And once again, I passed out and woke up in a completely sterile room. I laid in another hospital bed surrounded by other beds, but I could only hear the beep of my ventilator. I looked around and saw a wrapped up body laying on the bed across the room. I got up slowly and my back started feeling like it was on fire, but I pushed through with every step. Once I reached the bed, I saw a clipboard on top of the table next to it. Subject 1830. Status deceased. Cause of death aplastic anemia. Oh, Jack. I wanted to pull back the cover to see what he looked like. This man who had spent all his life locked away being harvested for some unknown reason. They didn't even have the decency to give him a name. Subject 1830. I really wanted to pull the cover, I swear I did, but I just didn't have it in me. I started to hear voices coming from the door at the end of the room, and I quickly went back to my bed. I closed my eyes but moved head to face the door, and with a beep, the doors automatically opened. "Sir, we have to finish the extraction for subject 1830 and prepare the crematory." A woman's voice spoke. I could hear the clacking of the typing of a laptop. "What a waste. It's a shame. He had the highest concentration of ambramine, and he was the longest lasting as well. The others never fared as well as he did." "How long did he last?" "His file says that he lasted over 18 years in this facility," the woman replied. "He used to be obsessed with that beanstalk story. Let's hope the new one doesn't take long to acclimate to his environment. We can't have the mental stress affecting his health. Our superiors are overestimating the production of ambramine. Those imbeciles keep signing contracts with superficial cosmetic companies and don't bother researching alternatives." I tried to look over to see, but I was afraid to make a sudden move, so I merely opened my eyes a tiny squint, looking over to see a red-headed overweight man standing next to a skinny, short nurse. That must be Dr. Rigo, the same one Jack said was the head of extractions. I tried to keep my eyes closed, and right as Dr. Rigo walked over to me, alarms started blaring throughout the building. "Crap, we have to follow the emergency protocols." Dr. Rigo pulled out a syringe from behind his back, and the nurse tried to rush forward, but I panicked, and I grabbed a panhandle and hit him in the face, causing him to drop the syringe. He stumbled back and grabbed at his head while the nurse lunged forward to grab the syringe, but I shoved her before she could grab it, and I jammed the syringe into the doctor's chest. The nurse went to the side and kept pushing a button near the side of the bed, as if she was calling for more staff. But the alarms were too loud for anyone to hear anything, so I punched her in the head and I fell forward. My vision was turning dark, and I could see the doors open and two men rushing in. I thought one of them looked familiar when I heard my name being called out. "Nick, hey buddy, I'm right here," said one of the men. I wanted to say something back, but my eyelids felt way too heavy for me to even see, much less speak. I woke up in the back of some sort of vehicle with a bunch of other men around me, 7 to be exact. I was beyond freaked out, but when I reached over, I realized that I knew some of them from photos of Uncle Bernard and his army buddies. "Hey, Sleeping Beauty is awake," replied the man sitting on my left. I think his name was Zane Mullins. His blonde hair and sad blue eyes made him stand out in the picture with my uncle. He was the only one I really recognized. I looked over at the passenger seat to see my Uncle Bernard leaning over to me. "All right, kid?" he asked, his voice carrying through the air like a soft thread. With those 4 simple words, I broke down sobbing like a little kid. I tried to open my mouth to say something, but I couldn't stop shaking, and I was gasping with every breath, just crying and crying. I didn't understand anything that had happened. I felt a hand pat on my shoulder in an attempt to comfort me. "Let it out, kid, you did fine," Bernard's voice said in a slight whisper. After a couple of hours, we finally arrived at a rundown motel in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't even sure what state we were in anymore, but I knew that we were nowhere near Kentucky. They gave me some actual clothes to change out of, the hospital gown, which was practically exposing all of me. The room itself was nothing special, but it was packed with diagrams, maps, and weapons laying all over the bed and the spare table. "What is all this?" I asked. "This was us planning to get you out of that place." "What was that place?" "We don't really know," my uncle asked while glancing over at Zane. "So, what do you know?" Zane moved an already open file that was on the table and shuffled some photos before passing it over to me. Unrecognizable black charred debris laid in a large pile. It was my house, or whatever was left of it. "Are my parents really dead?" I asked, hoping to hear that maybe like me, they were safe in a motel somewhere. My uncle nodded sadly. "I talked to one of the firemen that responded to the scene and said that he found the remains of both of your parents. The guy said they were both dead before the fire." "Can't we go to the cops?" "No. The fireman and the other guy were both found dead a couple of days later. Zane spoke up. The only reason I heard about the fire was because some private investigator named Jason Kusakova reached out to me, pertaining information regarding your whereabouts. He had stumbled upon something strange, and when he didn't hear back from your parents, he put two and two together and somehow found me. What do you mean, something strange? I asked. All the men pulled up a chair and took a seat at the table, while my uncle motioned me to sit across from him. The PI worked as a former detective before he retired, somewhere in New York City. In one of his cases, a kid was taken in broad daylight. The neighbors reported that there were black vans and men in suits patrolling the neighborhood a couple of days before the disappearance. He obtained footage of the kid being taken, and when he tried to bring it forward to his superiors, he was shut down and the footage was erased. The kid's family was later found dead due to carbon monoxide poisoning. He thinks something spooked his superiors so much that they covered it up. He paused before glancing over at Zane and then over at me. A week before the kid disappeared, he took a DNA test. He was also adopted. I felt a twinge of sadness and anger, but mostly guilt. Did I get my parents killed? Was I the cause of this? We don't want you to start blaming yourself. It's natural to feel curiosity about where you came from. Zane spoke up. I guess he could read the expression on my face. Yeah, it's not your fault. Another one of his friends, whose name I haven't learned yet, spoke up. My uncle gave a weak smile before looking back at the papers in front of us. So, where do I come in? I asked quietly. After the PI heard about the fire, he quickly combed over all the surveillance footage from nearby locations and found these. He pulled out a couple of photos, and upon closer inspection, it was the same old man and woman in the sundress that was at the mass service, in my extraction or harvesting, whatever it was. I looked over at my uncle, allowing him to continue. He gave them over to another guy that ran them through some fancy computer software, but he didn't just find their identities, a whole bunch. What do you mean? Like various different identities and aliases that span through different time periods. It doesn't make sense, but somehow they might be older than they look. We all thought it was maybe some weird resemblance or relation, but when we looked closer into their identities, we realized it was all fake. Nothing to them, just cardboard cutouts of what a person is supposed to be. Their current identities are Francine and Thomas Winton. On paper, they seem well-rounded, a bunch of fancy education and charities, but when we verified them, nothing came up. I know it didn't make sense to them, but I wanted to wait a bit before I told them my side of the story. Somehow, they just came to be and used their money to form a biotech startup. Zane shook his head before gulping down a glass of water. Nothing about it makes sense. I think I can add another piece to the puzzle. I started off before elaborating with the rest of my story. The men sat there in silence, just looking at the floor but listening to every word that I was saying. By the end, we sat there in silence, dwelling onto the overload of information we had all learned. If what he's saying is true, they're probably using that DNA stuff to track down individuals with whatever that thing is and using it to rejuvenate themselves, my uncle stated. I don't understand any of it. The science doesn't make any sense here. Another one of the men spoke up. Regardless of the science, one thing is for sure. They have enough money and power to hunt us down eventually. We saw their facility. It was bad enough we lost a couple of men during our rescue mission, but that was nothing. The hard part is staying off the grid until we can figure out our next steps. They lost men? How many people have already died because of me? I simply wanted to take a freaking DNA test and explore my background. I spent the rest of the night thinking and thinking. My uncle and his friends are better off without me. Heck, my uncle was sober and I'm not sure if Zane and he are a thing, but I can't bear being responsible for their deaths as well. I could invent them because they did so much for me, and somehow I stumbled upon this forum. I just wanted to vent on here. I'm not sure what to do. I guess I just wanted someone to hear my story before we go off the grid. Maybe I should just hand myself over.